Today we've got a great revenge story of stopping a creep in their tracks. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, how I out-psyched my West Point Psych 101 professor, mildly. This happened when I was a West Point cadet. The reason that matters will be clearer in a minute. The first day of Psych 101, my class section filed into the room and sat down. The psych professor, a captain in the US Army, showed up moments later. He introduced himself, said a few things about the curriculum, and then stopped when a late arriving cadet entered the room. For some professors, being late to a class was a moderately big deal. Others didn't care much. This guy apparently did because he said, "You're late, cadet." We all expected the latecomer to apologize with the standard, "No excuse, sir," and then take whatever dressing down he received with a proper degree of military courtesy, but he didn't. He said something like, "So what? It doesn't look like you started teaching anything yet." I can't quite convey the level of shock that response sparked in the rest of us. We were just plebes, the lowest of the low, and our fellow plebe had just exhibited a degree of disrespect that could literally get him court-martialed, or made him subject to administrative punishment, get kicked out of West Point, or at the very least, earn him enough demerits that he would be marching punishment tours back and forth in Central Area for the rest of his cadet career. But it didn't end there. The professor responded by yelling, "Who the heck do you think you are, speaking to a superior officer like that?" And the cadet yelled back, "I was 2 freaking minutes late. What did it matter? I had to run here all the way from gym class. Is it my fault the schedule doesn't give me enough time?" I'm making up this dialogue because it was so long ago, but the gist of it is that the cadet gave as good as he got. This went on for just under a minute, after which the captain kicked the cadet out of the classroom with a promise to follow up with the cadet's tactical officer, a commissioned officer, usually also a captain, who handles the military aspect of cadet life. Aghast is probably the best adjective for the rest of the class's reaction. We were aghast, speechless, in shock, and then the professor opened the door and asked the latecomer to return to the room. It was all a prank. The cadet had actually been a little early, so the professor arranged a little tableau for our benefit. For the life of me, I can't remember what it was supposed to demonstrate or what we were supposed to learn from it. Maybe it was about not intervening when a colleague was about to shoot himself in the foot? I honestly don't know. For some reason though, this poisoned me against that professor and psychology in general. If nothing else, it seemed juvenile, and at the time I hadn't learned to take myself less seriously. You don't get into West Point without spending a lot of your time with a stick up your butt trying to look like you should get into West Point. It was undignified. It lacked military decorum. I was ticked. He was a jerk for freaking with us, presumably for nothing more than his own amusement. My indignity faded over time though. It was a pretty interesting subject, and it turned out that the professor was kind of a goof. It wasn't the last prank he pulled on us, although it definitely was the one that raised my blood pressure the most. So eventually I forgave him, but I never forgot that first class session. And the end of the semester provided me with an unexpected opportunity for some petty revenge. My roommate had the course on his schedule at the beginning of the semester, but for some reason had to move it to the next. As luck would have it, the change happened after he had received his textbook. This sparked an idea. When the final exams came, I asked him if I could borrow it. That final for that class was an open book exam. The day of the test, I showed up to the class with my roomie's book tucked under my arm and sat down right in the first row of the seats. The professor handed out the exam booklets. He glanced at the clock and said, "You may open your tests." The room fell into a hush. Cadets never chatter during tests. That's when I took out my roommate's book and carefully tore off its stiff plastic wrapping. It was loud. The plastic wrap crinkled like a hard candy your grandma handed you in church. Everyone in the class stared at me. The professor stared the hardest. Then he said out loud what everyone else was thinking. "Cadet OP, is this the first time you're opening the textbook for my class?" Context: if true, that would have been extremely disrespectful. Class assignments, including readings, were roughly kinda sorta equivalent to direct orders. You were expected to come to class prepared to discuss the material. Failure to read the assignment could earn you demerits, and although it wasn't that common, repeated failure to do your coursework could end up in worse punishment. But I just looked him right in the eye and said, "Well, yes sir. After that stunt you pulled on the first day of class, I didn't think there was anything worth reading in it." And then, before he could toss me out of the classroom on my butt, I reached down and pulled out my actual textbook, which I'm sure he would have remembered seeing me with if he had thought about it sooner, since lots of other tests were also open book exams. And then I said, "Just kidding, sir. This is the real one." Admittedly, it was a big risk. I could have been kicked out, for reals. But I was already known for being a low-key class clown, a coping mechanism I developed in response to the stress of the plebe year, and the professor was the least military out of any military officer I've ever served under. Witty repartee was encouraged, and he never got mad when anybody cracked a joke. Honestly, I think he liked getting a bit of comeuppance for his frequent shenanigans. At any rate, he laughed his butt off when I brought out my actual, heavily annotated and highlighted textbook. And so, he gave us an extra couple of minutes to make up for the interruption. We finished our exams, and that was the end of Psych 101. He did pull me aside after the test was over and said something like, "Please don't pull anything like this with your other professors, cadet." But it was more in a friendly way because he said he didn't want his style of teaching to make me think it would be okay to do the same thing to other classes. And before people do the "and then everybody clapped" thing, this is probably the least embellished story I've ever told on the internet. It was 40 years ago, but pretty much everything happened almost exactly as I described it, or at least as well as I can recall it. Obviously, I had to recreate some of the dialogue, but I'd rehearsed that last zinger so many times that it's etched into my memory like the definition of leather. And it made an impression on at least one other person, because one of my former classmates told the story about me when we ran into each other at a reunion. So did OP actually get revenge here, or did the professor achieve what they may have been looking to accomplish from the get-go? Which is, with all these young adults who grew up having a stick up their butt getting into West Point, giving them that platform to actually become clowns. Some actual levity in their otherwise rigid schooling. Renbar commented, "You did learn a lesson, to take the point stick out of your backside once in a while and use your brain, and you showed it with your own prank." Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy awesome stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is Bragging Cyclist Gets a Workout. This is one of my dad's stories from when he was an engineering apprentice. A guy he worked with was extraordinarily proud of the racing bike he came to work on. He boasted daily about its high-spec, high-tech, space-age materials, how he could lift it on one finger, and so on. The apprentices decided to have some fun. Every few days, they snuck out and dismantled the bike frame just enough to sneak in a ball bearing, and then put everything back together. After some weeks, the frame was full of steel ball bearings, and the bike guy could barely lift it with one hand, let alone a finger. I could imagine that guy's actually kind of freaking out, like, is something happening to my hand? Why can't I lift this anymore? I was able to do it before with one finger. Although realistically, somebody that's so proud of their space-age material bike, they probably know exactly how much it used to weigh. I imagine hardly being able to lift it anymore would drive them crazy enough to weigh it and figure out, why does it all of a sudden actually weigh way more? Aussie Mick 1984 commented, "Reminds me of a butthead maintenance engineer my old boss hired and who was instantly too IC despite being crap at his job, and a proper junior in terms of skill let alone organization. After he stuffed up yet another job for my department, I asked one of the skilled guys to fix it. He mentioned in an offhanded but deliciously malicious way that Chuck, the butthead, didn't lock his toolbox. After Chuck, the butthead, left for the night, we opened his toolbox, emptied it, and melted a small piece of lead to perfectly line the base. We were a metal plant with lots of raw metal and oxy torches around. Once set, we repacked it and went on our way. Process above was repeated every time he screwed up a job, and by the time I left, the thing weighed so much he wheeled it around on a trolley rather than trying to lift it like he used to. Screw you, Chuck. Hope that thing still weighs you down." This next story is Mean Neighbor? Spit on him. This happened in the 1960s, and also not to me but to my father, who still tells the story every so often and laughs every time about it. Back when he was around 10 years old, I'm guessing here to be honest, but he couldn't have been older than that, he and his family lived in an apartment building on the first floor. They had a pretty nasty neighbor, always yelling at my dad and his sister when he saw them in the staircase, saying they carry in dirt and should clean more often and whatnot. He would be loud overall, calling the kids nasty words and just being a jerk. He also was bald, which will become important later. Cue the day my dad saw an opportunity to get a little revenge and didn't hesitate to act upon it. He used to look out the open window down at the street, and so he was standing there as he saw the neighbor leaving the house right underneath him. So my dad leaned a little out of the window, positioned himself right, and let a huge drop of spit splash onto the bald neighbor's head. My dad didn't see the reaction as he quickly pulled his head back in to avoid detection, but he did hear the neighbor curse the birds very loudly, alright. According to him, the neighbor never found him out. He also never told his parents, but was, and still obviously is, very proud of this little revenge. Hawk Tua spit on that thing, and then in parentheses, the evil bald guy's head. But also most importantly, I'm sorry for dropping such a stale reference. Our next story is, over the CB came, which one of you boys wants to get his butt kicked? Frequent lurker, thought I'd try one of my own. I was a flatbed semi-driver for about 15 years all over the US. Don't exactly remember where this was, but I'm out of Colorado and this was south and east, maybe most of the way to Florida? Anyway, parked somewhere on the side of the road leading up to a receiver, whole line of us waiting till they open in the morning. Anyway, people start to jaw on the radio. We're pretty solitary, so end of day when we get a chance, we shoot the crap. Anyway, over the radio comes this booming voice. Which one of you boys wants to get his butt kicked? Radio went silent and I just waited for someone to respond. I'm about average sized, but tussled plenty. Anyway, waited and waited, nothing. So I get a crazy idea in my head. When you're small, you learn to use crazy. I said, you know, it's been a long time since I've had my butt kicked right and proper. I mean, back in the day, I got my butt kicked proper by a few guys. A good many professional MMA guys. In fact, I even got my butt kicked by a Gracie. You know what? Heck yeah. I'm in a fine mood to get my butt kicked proper. Let's get it on. Now, all of this was true, but not to the extent that it sounds like. It was like a cousin of the Gracie. Still a black belt and wicked good, little scrappy guy, but not like Royce or anything. Anyway, I let off the key of the mic and listened to nothing but crickets. I never would have fought the guy, not except for a good reason, but I just wanted him to think just a little about spouting off like that to random strangers who he hadn't even seen with his eyes. I fell asleep to those crickets with a smile on my face. I hope I entertained one or two of you with this story. I get so much pleasure from reading all yours. Cheers. You know, the story brought me back to when I was a kid and my dad had a mobile radio in his truck. I can't even remember where we were going necessarily, but I remember some random guy picked up on the radio. It was kind of faint, so he must have not been too close. And my dad encouraged me, so I grabbed the mic and started talking back to this guy who was saying random things, and he got so angry. He wanted nothing but for me to get off of the air, get off of the channel. I can't remember what he said, but I'm almost positive he was spewing some vile stuff. And I was returning fire with the most dumb child things I could say. Like the meanest things a 5-year-old could come up with, like, you stink, and this guy was heated. Legaleo1 commented, we used to get that in paving jobs. We would just tell him to come to the Blue Mac and your wish would be granted. That particular truck was driven by the original tallywhacker. He was a little guy, about 6'6", and went almost 325 pounds. Once they laid eyes on what looked like a giant tree stump, they always left without another word. Our next story is pranking a crappy boss. Not my own story, but one my dad told me years ago about a coworker/friend of his. We'll call him Greg. Greg had a particular hatred for his boss, who was pretty awful. Greg was also good at tinkering and creating small contraptions, so he made a small device with a motion sensor and piece that played cricket sounds. The sounds would stop whenever the sensor detected motion, so Greg placed this device on top of a cupboard right outside of his boss's office. It would play the sound non-stop until the boss came out to look for the offending cricket. This went on for about a week until pest control was eventually called. Greg removed the device before they came and then replaced it after they were done. The boss never did find that cricket that was driving him insane. This almost kind of feels like a The Office level prank. Something relatively harmless unless this guy's got like a phobia of crickets, but also still delightfully long term. Opinionated Poster commented, boy, that reminds me of a story I've read years ago about an IT person who was full of himself, and apparently his IT He said he finds all the viruses and nobody can fool him because he knows the systems in and out. Enter the geeks who wrote and registered a little few liners, which every time Mr. IT moved his mouse, let out a big oink. The guy spent the rest of the day shaking from laughter when the dude started running one scan after the other one. When he escalated it, oh, what an ego slap, they removed it. So the central IT asked him if he was alright. The rest of the guy sat that out with a straight face, which I believe was a lot harder than anything. "Why'd you do that?" commented. Once convinced a coworker that we had gone into his computer and pulled a prank. We had a history of inter-office stupidity and he'd been on the giving and receiving end of plenty. After an hour of him sitting through everything he could think of, he demanded to know what we did. We told him that he could delete the prank file if he could hunt it down. We told him the file name was ID10T. Dude was in DOS typing "find idiot" and every iteration he could think of before he finally realized it. Our next story is Ask and You Shall Receive. About 25 years ago, I used to work in sales. There would be about 4 to 5 people in a van, and we would work 12 to 14-hour days. I would usually bring my own lunch, snacks, and drinks, but we would stop at convenience stores to buy stuff too. There were 2 guys in the van that mooched food or would ask other people to buy them food because they were always hungry. One night, I got sick of hearing them whine. We were at our last comfort stop before the 2-hour drive home, and I didn't want to listen to them whine about being hungry the whole trip. I bought myself a sandwich and a liter of soda and a big bag of Fritos, gave the bag of Fritos to the 2 moochers. They were all happy for about half an hour. They then started to ask for something to drink. "Sorry, you only said you were hungry, not thirsty. I don't have anything for you to drink." Then they asked if they can have some of my soda. Nope. I finished the last bit in front of them and took a nap. Word got around what I did, so anytime they asked for food, the only thing people would buy for them was Fritos. Eventually they quit asking. My boyfriend said that I was mean, but I taught them a lesson. I didn't mind helping someone that needed it, but these 2 could afford their own food and just try to take advantage of someone, so be careful what you ask for. They only asked for something to eat. I did exactly what they asked. Wouldn't have worked on me if I was one of those moochers. I don't really care for Fritos all that much. In fact, the only Fritos I actually care for are the honey barbecue twists, which actually are very good. Book-loving cyclist commented, "Well played. Fritos are the best. I would be happy with the free revenge Fritos on the daily, even if my gut wouldn't agree but would be smart enough to bring water along for the day. You were too nice to get them anything. I would have totally ignored them." Drew Basque Adam commented, "I love Fritos too and always make sure I have something to drink when I eat them. At first I felt bad for them as I really thought they couldn't afford something to eat. After I'd been there for a while, I realized what they were doing. I didn't want to listen to them all the way home, so it was time for a lesson." Our next story is Don't Make Me Choose For You. I used to work graveyard shift at a gas station. In my city, there's a law that says the cashier must be behind locked doors between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. for safety reasons. At my store, all the transactions during this time took place through a service window. If the customer wanted anything from inside the store, I had to get it for them. Rather, a lot of people would ask for a pack of gum. At first, I just grabbed the closest one, but a lot of people would go, "No, not that kind," and maybe get a different type. So I started asking questions. Minty or fruity? Chiclet or soft chew? This seemed to work for a while. One night, a guy asked for a pack of gum, so I asked my questions. He yelled, "I don't freaking care, just get the freaking gum." So I got him a pack of Thrills, the purple kind that tastes so much like soap that the package actually says, "This tastes like soap." He didn't even look before popping one in his mouth, which he then spat out while cussing. I laughed so hard. From then on, anyone who gave me a hard time about making them choose a gum got Thrills. Also, whenever a customer who asked for any carbonated beverage ticked me off, I'd shake the ever-loving bejesus out of it before putting it in the service window. I even got to see the payoff a couple of times. I think the Thrills thing is one thing. I don't know if I would go as far as antagonizing these people by shaking it up and potentially having that go down right there. I mean, I know you're behind locked doors and all, but somebody snaps and who knows how well that locked door can really keep a wild human at bay. Also, if Thrills gum actually legitimately tastes like soap to the point where it's advertised, how do they stay in business? Is there really a big enough customer base that buys soap-flavored gum? Ariel Ham 10 commented, reminds me of the time when I was working at a gas station and a guy asked me what the most popular can of chew was so he could buy it. I told him probably the one we're out of. He didn't appreciate my answer. I thought it was funny. Our next story is, your pen? You're right, I should never. A few decades ago, I was living with my then husband Joe in the California Bay Area. His mother, back home in New York, was an epic, evil mother-in-law to me, expressing opposition to my existence even before she and I had met. Joe wavered between basking in her constant admiration of him and recoiling from her smothering him. For me, she had never had anything but contempt, and she occasionally managed to manipulate arguments between me and my guy. Mother-in-law telephoned frequently, which I found strange since my parents always left it up to me to call them rather than risk imposing themselves. Mother-in-law had no such qualms. Joe wanted to avoid her calls, so I was often the one to answer the phone, and I would usually make up some excuse as to why Joe couldn't be reached right then. This was before we got our first answering machine. They weren't yet common. Being an early riser, mother-in-law hated that our lifestyle included sleeping in until at least 10 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday mornings after staying out late on Friday or Saturday nights, often dancing at clubs or going to movies. Living 3 time zones ahead of us, mother-in-law felt impatient having to wait to call her precious boy to hear his voice. I assume she got him on the phone soon after he got to the office on weekdays where he couldn't duck her calls. So pretty much every weekend, she would phone us around 7 or 8 a.m. on a Saturday or Sunday. Nothing Joe said could dissuade her. She believed that as his mother, it was her right, and that we were lucky that she wasn't calling even earlier. Being a light sleeper, I would quickly rise to answer the phone before Joe's sleep would be disturbed. I refused to wake him just to let his mom smother him, and Joe was grateful for my running interference. His mother would seethe in helpless fury at my disobedience to her, demanding, "Let me talk to my son." Oh heck no, I wasn't waking that man, but would be happy to take a message. Early one Saturday morning, mother-in-law actually had a message to leave that required me to get pen and paper, probably a phone number. I rummaged on Joe's desk for a pen, then faithfully wrote down the info and eventually got that awful, demanding woman off the phone. Meanwhile, Joe's form loomed in the doorway. The sound of my messing with his desk apparently had alarmed him into getting up. As soon as I hung up, he demanded whether I had used his pen. Yep, I had. So what? Joe had OCD, which made him good at his detail-oriented job, but a bit of a jerk at home when it came to his personal belongings. Whatever was his wasn't to be touched by me, and was cared for meticulously by him. But whatever was mine was used by him carelessly. He accidentally broke my stuff, but only my stuff. I tended to ignore his absurd, selfish rules about what I could touch of his, but I was admittedly an absent-minded pen thief, accidentally carrying away whatever pen I had in my hand. So he had a good reason to protect his more expensive pens from me. Seeing his favorite pen in my hand, Joe became furious and raised his voice, yelling at me to never again touch his pens. I tried to protest that I'd been doing him a favor, but Joe's righteous anger kept him ranting. I was seething at the injustice and said coolly, "You're right. What I did was completely wrong." Then I grabbed the phone, it was a big heavy thing back then, and started dialing. Joe suddenly looked uneasy, all anger gone. I was calling his mother. When Joe realized this, he started frantically gesturing at me to stop. In the sweetest voice, while glaring balefully at my husband, I apologized profusely to mother-in-law for gatekeeping her away from her son. Joe slowly put his hands to his head in horror. I said that Joe had just now scolded me at length for not putting him on the phone with his mother and that I had promised him to never do that again. Joe theatrically sank to his knees with his clenched hands raised towards me in supplication. Then the kicker, I told my mother-in-law that Joe was standing here wanting to talk to her and that I'm giving him the phone now. Joe would have preferred to be in a dentist chair getting drilled than talk to his clingy mother on the phone, especially first thing in the morning. He didn't move for a long moment while I stood there holding the receiver towards him. Finally, when the delay had gotten awkward, he reluctantly took the phone and started talking to his mom. For the rest of our short marriage, I never again answered the phone early on a weekend morning, nor did I ever again get in the way of Joe's mother's calls to her son. I'd always cheerfully let mother-in-law know that he is right here and wanting to speak with her. I mean, somebody in a marriage being unable to stand up to their own mom being overly suffocating and just obnoxious. I'm not saying the marriage was doomed from the get-go because of that kind of behavior and that inability to stand up to her, but it certainly was not a good starting point. Thinks I love your butt commented, "Good for you, that marriage sounded painful." Any partner who makes you responsible for their anxiety, not to mention their awful mother, is far from supportive, caring, kind. Freak him and his mom. Our next story is stopped a creep in his tracks. Many years ago, I graduated from college and went straight into a pastry arts program. It was a chef program, but pastry was the last half of their studies, so I joined halfway through the year. I was 22 and there were a wide array of humans in the class, from people my age to 50s, men and women, people with extensive culinary experience to pretty much none. Not long after I started, a guy in the class, probably mid-40s or so, began to be creepy to me. He would sidle up to me and call me sweetie or sweetheart and smirk. I didn't realize that he'd already tried this crap with every other girl in the class, but since I was new, he thought I would be an easy mark, I guess. I directly told him to stop talking to me. Going to the instructors would have gone nowhere. They were French and probably wouldn't care in the slightest. Towards the end of the program, so yes, I put up with a creep for months, keeping my distance, I was at the 3-compartment sink. It was the end of class and everyone was washing up quickly in order to leave. He sidled up to me and made the sweetie remark. I said, "I told you to stop talking to me," to which he smirked. So quick as a wink, I snatched his glasses off his face and threw them into the dishwasher. I wear contacts myself, and I know how awful it is to suddenly be rendered blind. The other students around me were laughing as his hands flew up to his face. Too late, and he fumbled around to fish them out of the water. He never bothered me again. I kind of wish the class had been longer, just so I could feel superior for a while. I think OP's completely justified. That said, as a glasses wearer, this kind of reminds me of the importance of the things that allow me to actually see. And not only would I be terrified of somebody doing something like this just for the fact that I couldn't see, the glasses are also really freaking expensive. My glasses would look like Professor Farnsworth's from Futurama if I didn't pay $1 billion to make sure that they're high refraction or whatever, so they're thinner. MJK 1988 commented, "Good for you and creep deserved it, but I'm absolutely dying at they were French and probably wouldn't care because LMAO and true." This next story is lean your seat back on a flight, pay the price. For context, I lean my seat back on flights, so I'm not saying not to do it at all. The problem that occurred was on takeoff. The guy had his seat back from the get-go and the flight attendant came around and told him to put his seat up a couple times. Eventually, the flight attendant helped him put it up. As soon as she left, he leaned his seat back again. Such a jerk move. The whole entire flight, 2.5 hours, I dug my knees into his seat hard. I did it at different spots too. I know he could feel it because he kept adjusting and eventually gave a quick glance back, but was too sissy to say anything. Did my knees and muscles hurt while doing it? Absolutely, but it was well worth it. As an added note, it's a safety hazard to passengers to have your seat reclined during takeoff and landing. Now, I completely understand during takeoff and landing, but in general, you kinda do pay whatever money, especially in economy, to be able to recline the seat if it can. What really bothers me is when you see the pictures of people who flip their hair over the top of the seat, especially if you have those little TV screens in the back of the seat in front of you. This blonde lady's gross hair just covering up the screen because they wanna have it flipped over the back of the seat. Creedery commented, "Different kind of petty for me. I never recline the full way, just enough to get comfortable and only on long-haul flights. Person behind didn't appreciate me reclining a little bit while the person next to me was fully reclined and kept purposely nudging my seat. Righto. If I'm getting bumped around, then I'm going to be properly comfortable, so I reclined the entire way back. The bumping stopped. I lifted it back up a bit. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely awesome revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.